All right, thanks so much. I'm just going to do a really quick intro here because I don't want to take any time away from the actual panel. So this topic is mDL. I think the topic doesn't need an explanation. This is a very hot topic in our industry. So let me just introduce our panelists and I'll let them take it away. So we have David Keltz, who's the Director of Product Development, Mobile ID at Get Group. And we have Christina Yasuda, who works as an identity standards architect at Microsoft. So welcome, Christina. We have Lafi Jordan coming in through Zoom. So are you with us, Lafi?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon.
Wonderful. So Lafi is a business solution architect with the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. Thank you for joining us. We have Jason Borer, who is the executive director of the Secure Technology Alliance. And finally, we have Jamie Danker, who is a senior director of cybersecurity services at Venable LLP. So who's going to take it away? All right, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Megan. Thanks again for the introductions. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in, knowing that we're on a limited time table. Here, as we jump in, I'm going to go ahead and start off with Lafi, since he's remote. He's going to give you a quick overview related to mobile driver's license, some of the good work that's been going on for the past several months.
Thank you very much, Jason. So what I intend to do today is to give you a brief overview of what's happening in the world of mDL, specifically referring first to the standard that has just been published. Talk a little bit about why does it work, how does interoperability work, how is it achieved, and why verify can trust mDL data. So on the next slide, we have a high-level overview of what 18013-5 covers. As I mentioned, it was published in September, as a matter of fact, and in its current rendition, it covers the attended use case. So use where two persons are close to it, that the reader and the mDL holder is close together. It specifies a data transmission and authentication protocol, covers device-to-device engagement, device-to-device data retrieval, as well as server data retrieval, and allows various technologies for those different components. So that's 18013-5. Now, on the next slide, we start looking at where the standard fits into the broader ecosystem. 18013-5 specifies the interface between a device and the reader, as well as the interface between the reader and the issuing authority infrastructure. And that's specified for two purposes. One is for server data retrieval, and the other one is for the distribution of public keys, which we'll come to a little bit later. The interface between an issuing authority's infrastructure and the mDL device itself is the subject of a different ISO standard, 23220, which is currently under construction. So now let's move on and look at under the covers a little bit. How does this work? How does an mDL work? We have two modes of operation. One is offline and online. So first, the offline operation. So that would start by an issuing authority provisioning data, the actual data, mDL data, onto a device. At the same time, the issuing authority has to make sure that it distributes its public key to all the readers out there. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but there is that action that needs to happen. So the verifier or the reader now has the public key of the issuing authority. At transaction time, the reader and the mDL sets up or starts a connection using NFC or a QR code, and that's just to exchange setup information. Subsequent to that, there's a separate communication channel established that is used to send a request and get a response. And so the next animation that you'll see will show the communication channel being set up using BLE or Wi-Fi aware or NFC, and the reader sends a request to the mDL. The mDL, after the holder authorizes the release, will then send information back to the reader. The reader then uses the public key of the issuing authority to check if the information that it received is good. And if the authentication checks out, then it knows that everything is good. And it would compare the picture of the portrait image to the person standing in front of the verifier to make sure that the data belongs to the mDL holder. So that's offline operation. If we now look at online operation, it starts in a similar way, where the issuing authority provisions information onto the mDL. In this case, though, it's not the actual mDL information, it is a token. After that, the issuing authority still has the responsibility to distribute its public key, so that still happens, as you'll see in this animation. At transaction time, as was the case in the offline operation, and a communication channel is established between the reader and the mDL, again using one of those two technologies, and subsequently a separate communication channel is set up. Again, the request comes from the reader to the mDL, and the mDL holder approves the release of information, which transmits now a token instead of mDL information to the reader, the verifying entity. The verifying entity now has to authenticate the token, check that it's a good token. It does that using the public certificate of the issuing authority. And once it's checked that this is a good token, it would interact directly with the issuing authority, essentially submitting the token to the issuing authority in order to be returned back the information that was requested. And that protocol can happen via web API or OIDC. So that then, at a very high level, the two methods of operation and a high level technical flow. So why can we trust an mDL? On the next slide, we'll see the challenge that we have before us. We have issuing authorities on the one side, we have verifiers on the other side. We envision, and AMVA is in the process of standing up, a digital trust service that sits in between. The digital trust service will collect public key certificates from issuing authorities, making sure that when it receives it, it actually came from a valid issuing authority, that it is of good quality. We know that there are challenges with public key certificates, making sure that they're good, and that the issuing authorities comply with certain minimum requirements as far as their operations are concerned. Once the digital trust service has done all of that, it can then package the information and provide it to verifiers. So each verifier will then get a package containing the public key certificates of all the jurisdictions that the digital trust service has verified as being good jurisdictions. In 18013-5 speak, we refer to that package as the VICAL. And so that enables the verifiers then, if it trusts the digital trust service, to authenticate at transaction time mDL information, linking it all the way back to the issuing authority. So in a nutshell, that is the trust model for mDL. Jason, and that is it. Within my allotted time, I have tried to cover a lot in a little, so later on, if there are opportunity for questions, I'd be happy to take that.
That was a great overview. Thank you, Lafi. We're going to go ahead and move on and talk about scalability and scope. And next up, I'm going to go ahead and bring in Christina. Knowing that existing driver's licenses are probably our dominant form of identification here in the United States, as well as many other parts of the globe, it's important that the technology scale, not only from state to state, but also from country to country, but also in terms of issuance and authentication of the mobile driver's license. In order to provide some scope or boundaries to the technology, many of the pioneers in this space often refer to the launch of the technology as day one capability versus day two capability. Can you please give our audience some background on those two areas and the work being done on both fronts?
Thank you. Can you pull up the slide? Next slide. Perfect. So my key message to you here today would be, while we have 18013 Part 5, what we call Day 1, but that is mainly focusing on in-person attended use case, what we call, because that very first handshake where user presents a code to establish, the security features, exchange the keys, that has to be NFC or QR code. It, requires the physical presence, arguably. So in terms of scalability, the work that is ongoing is how do we address the use case of presenting mobile driving license for identity verification on the web. Use cases like, what if I want to present mobile driving license to purchase alcohol online, or not just in person, NFC. So while obviously the first focus right now is to make sure that the current Day 1 get adopted, then at the same time, the question that already the ISO working group and then the relying parties are starting to think is, how do we enable these mDL use cases over the web? And we need more web expertise in the ISO group, and the action would be, if you have a concrete use case you have for mobile driving license using over the web, or the input, please reach out, please. That's like what we're currently thinking. And probably an important distinction in terms of use cases would be, initial origin of the work was really issuer intended use case of presenting driving license for driving privileges, right? Which is very different from presenting driving license for identity verification purposes. So those are some important distinctions to make when thinking about use cases and security mechanisms required. If we can go to the next slide. So a couple of considerations. And one thing to highlight is, as Lafi just explained, there are mechanisms for online presentation, but because the first handshake is kind of dependent on QR code or NFC, that's kind of the presentation of data happens online, so you can enable some certain online presentation using connective and using the current specification, but if you want an online presentation directly between the the user and the verifier without talking to a third-party server, that's something that needs to be addressed as well. And a couple of considerations to be, current Part 5 is mainly about CBOR. That's how NFC works. And we did bring arguably with WebAuthn, some CBOR into the web world, but how can we kind of find this balance between already existing mDLs that will be issued in a compliant way with Part 5 into this web world to enable this web infrastructure? And as a relying party, as a verifier, in what form would you want to consume a mobile driving license is a question. And building an open and fair ecosystem, that's a quick comment on, we don't want certain features to be limited to certain providers, in a sense that if you would have several mDL wallets on the phone, we want them to equally open selection of the phones and access to the hardware bound keys. That's something that as an ecosystem we should be working on. And the last quick comment would be, Part 5, the current standard, current work really focuses on mobile driving license, as the specification suggests, but there's also ongoing work to prepare building blocks to digitize other types of citizen identity, such as national ID cards, residence permit, and per the comment of international scalability. This work has been really not just US, but also having involvement of European counterparts in Australia, in APAC, in Asia, in Japan. So that's where this kind of, you're preparing these building blocks that can be scalable, data models and whatnot. Maybe some of you are interested in verifiable credentials. That's also an ongoing kind of coexistence with this great high assurance mobile driving license specification with other types of user claims.
All right, very good. Thank you, Christina. Next up, as I mentioned, there's a ton of great work going on with mobile driver's licenses. I'm going to go ahead and ask David to come up and give us a quick market overview. I'll move on. You want me to go on to the next slide?
Yeah, I'll run it and then
All right, there you go.
hand it back to you. Great. So one of the great things about having this day one and day two lets us put a standard out there and look at these in-person attended use cases and develop some of those out. And as Christina mentioned, we want to build an open and fair ecosystem. The ecosystem is really a part of this. You have digitally signed data from the issuer that's carried by and controlled by the mDL holder. They can hand a subset of that to the verifier. The verifier uses public key to check the data. So that naturally of itself creates an ecosystem for the use of the driver's license. So the questions are like, how do you sort of start to build this out? And what's the progress of where this is in North America? So this is a slide which shows a map based on something Secure Technology Alliance put together. It's available on mdlconnection.com that you see there, and it has sort of where the green being sort of legislative action, so that there's planning happening, into the yellow and orange where there's active pilots happening, and I'm going to talk about one of those pilots today. And so we've got, at this point, sort of tens of thousands of mDL holders across the United States for the most part. There are some international pilots as well. And with plans, projections to be in the hundreds of thousands at the end of the year and into early next year. There's a number of businesses that have already sort of jumped forward to say, okay, we want to be part of the ecosystem. We want to be perceived as advanced in our technology implementations. This is something we do for our customers that have jumped forward. Obviously, there's been quite a lot with Apple's announcement of listing 8 states, plus adding in the fact that TSA will start to accept these during the course of, I think, what will be next year. So. Sure thing. Sure, the green is basically legislative, I guess you would call it blue-green. Teal is legislative actions happen, so there's like a planning process in place. There are custom, proprietary implementations that have rolled out. So you have a couple of those there with Colorado, Louisiana. There are some that are in sort of a limited production status, so they're out, and there are people with holders in the sort of yellow color. There's some active pilots or just about to roll out with the orange, and I'm going to talk about one of those. And then I think the other one, and then other activities, sort of related activities or activities that might come back together in the red color. All right, so I'm going to talk about Utah because it's a pilot my company is involved with, and sort of what we've seen, what we've learned from the demand of building this ecosystem. The approach here was to build both sides of the ecosystem at the same time, not just to have people who are now holders, but then also sort of use the business side of this, the businesses that will accept a mobile driver's license, to sort of drive the demand and create pull. You've got this chicken and egg situation where if people get the mDL and there's no place to use it, they'll give up. Businesses are waiting to say, well, how many people have it? So how do we do this? We basically have rolled out every month a different business that is accepting it within Utah, used that to create the press. It's actually been like beyond what the expectations were about what the press coverage would be, particularly local. Each of those, if you have the slide deck, is a link to an article that has come out. 3 announced businesses now, plus some state agencies coming. Those 5 use cases are going to cover most of the primary top ones where you say, oh, I'm going to use my driver's license for this particular. And then there's multiples in the queue as well. So, and from a standpoint of holders, we're getting right around 2,000 right now. We've kept the number sort of smaller by using provisioning. And there's a big range of demographics. We'll go to 10,000 in the next couple of months, up to 100,000, and then production in March of 2022, perhaps April. And the integration was about 3 to 4 months to complete the integration for the issuer to put that together and be completely synchronized with the mDL system. On right-hand side here are some of the first people that got their mDLs in Utah. I'll talk a little bit about the demographics because I think it speaks to the demand. The events at which provisioning have happened, there have been lines, people lined up to get it, which is really interesting. You would think that, okay, these are tech early adopters, but really what the demographics show is maybe not. The youngest person was 16, oldest person was 87. The buckets fall precisely equal between 20s, 30s, and 40s. So you can't really say that there's like, young tech people pulling it. I mean, although 40 is young. And then strangely, 65% men, 35% women. So I don't know what that is, but and a pretty significant chunk, smaller than the other age categories, but of 65 and over, actually. So it's really interesting to see that it kind of cuts across all the demand is there across all of them. And so both from the press and from the people, and then from the business activity, I think we're seeing the demand is there for this as a product. We've done real life transactions, so we've had actual alcohol purchases, actual pharmacy pickups. We've had bank account openings that all happened, people using them at these events with their mDLs. So Harmon's Grocery Store, Utah Community Credit Union, we have some other ones coming out, Highway Patrol. And we've done some testing on using alternate devices like the Apple Watch and so on. So this is both iOS and Android. So I'm just going to set up for later in the week. So this looking at day one and then day one plus. How could we potentially expand upon what's in day one? What are some of the concepts that we might be able to build upon that are sort of in day one in order to add? So you as FIDO Alliance and others have come at the identity problem from an internet perspective, and the ISO group chose to come at this from an in-person perspective, and now it's time to sort of mix those two things together and cover some of the use cases. So mDL as an authenticator would be pretty interesting. You have the identity attributes and the proofing behind that. So using it as a FIDO authenticator. Could you do an unattended transaction, something like the beer vending machine, using CTAP? Could you follow on to the data exchange with a challenge and response that shows that the user's been authenticated? And as well, as you move into the online space, OpenID Connect is one of the data transfer methods that Lafi mentioned. So it's basically the authorized flow with that token that the user can release the data. So could that same authorized flow be used for login at websites and then used to protect mDL attributes? So on Thursday, we'll have a session to start to brainstorm and talk about some of those things. Happy for all of you to come along and bring your brainstorming hats. And then as well, Secure Technology Alliance in November, we'll have a one-day mDL workshop. It follows the US Payments Forum member event. There is an mDL test event, so all of the vendors who are testing interop of mDLs, it's I think the fourth one that we've had to test the standard and prove that it's working, which is proven true. That's on the 10th, and then the 11th is the workshop. So you're all certainly invited to that.
All right, very good. Thank you, David. I do want to give just the last minute here to Jamie. Is obviously whenever you roll out a technology like this, one of the first questions that pops up is related to privacy. But if you could maybe just give us a quick overview in terms of some of the key things that we're considering as we begin to roll out the technology.
Sure. Thanks for inviting privacy to the party. Privacy is really a core component of any implementation. I've spent 20 years in various privacy roles. I was in the U.S. federal government, at Homeland Security for 10 years as a privacy officer. I was one of the authors of privacy requirements and considerations in 863. So as homework for everyone, I would take a look, especially at 863C, and Section 9 has a lot of privacy considerations that really can apply to any digital identity implementation. When it comes to mobile driver's licenses, the two top concerns that always come up with digital identity are tracking and profiling. And since privacy is really a core component of building trust, if users don't trust the MDL, they're not going to use it. So to build trust, you need to bake privacy into the implementation. That includes into the standards itself. So mechanisms to limit tracking and profiling, data minimization mechanisms, and not just articulating it as a aspirational principle. How actually are you going to operationalize that principle in your implementation? Not collecting more than you need for a specific transaction. 63 speaks to how you might actually achieve that. And actually, I think mobile driver's licenses themselves can have some privacy positive benefits. And for example, that alcohol purchase age verification use case, when you go present your physical driver's license now, you're providing a lot of data. But with a mobile driver's license, you have the ability for selective disclosure. And then even beyond that, 863 also talks about this too, providing the ability for just validating instead of providing full attribute values to relying parties, so that the user's data is not spilling all over across various relying parties. Then other considerations as well go back to, and I'm a big fan of NIST. I've supported their special publications, so I like their privacy engineering objectives of predictability and manageability, and so ensuring that users have reliable assumptions about how their data are being used, and that the consent, that there's meaningful consent implemented in the process. So I know we've run out of time, but if we do have time for questions, I think it would be interesting for those on the panel to talk about some of the ways in which the standard implements privacy, or how privacy is baked into the standard.
All right, very good. Thank you, Jamie. As I know we're butting up against our time slot, we'd be happy to address any questions offline, so please feel free to approach us if warranted. Thank you, guys.